Hello, and welcome to Improbable Things. I'm J. Grace Pennington, and this is my podcast where I share 6 improbable thoughts before breakfast, which for this podcast consists of 6 thoughts about reading, writing, or just storytelling in general. So I'm up early this morning with my 6 thoughts well before breakfast and ready to get started sharing them with you. So number 1, I'm continuing to read my latest book, or at least my latest first draft, to my husband in the evenings when we can. And I'm still catching so many small to medium things that need to be fixed. Everything from typos to lots of repeated words to small parts of the storyline that I never quite explained and that got left hanging. So a lot of things like that to be fixed. But I will say I'm probably about a third of the way into it and really haven't seen any big picture things that seem like they need fixing. It feels like the basic gist of the story is good. And even my husband, who doesn't really tend to love science fiction, has been saying that he feels like it's moving along really well and that I jump into the action maybe quicker than some of my other books have, which he likes. So I feel like it's good. Like, again, it's cringy when you're reading through work and see like, I missed a word or put the wrong word or, this sentence just doesn't make sense or whatever, stuff like that. But that stuff is so easy to go back and fix. So much easier than big, huge things. So we'll see. There might still be, still some things that he or the other readers go, oh, that's not working, that major part of the story. But so far, I think it's going pretty good. So we'll see, but I'll definitely keep you all updated. So number 2, I'm continuing to focus more right now on audiobook production. And there's one thing that has helped me so much in doing audiobooks, because I've done them off and on for many, many years. And this is just something very small, but it has really revolutionized my audio editing process because I really enjoy the recording part of it. I love reading aloud. I really like that part where you're actually getting to, actually reading the story. But the technical side of it, I always struggle with. And part of that is because I'm just not that technically savvy, and so I generally have some problems with my recordings and with audio quality that I have to, work a lot on fixing. But also, the editing part is extremely boring to me. And part of that is because, there's no way to speed it up. You just have to sit and listen very thoroughly to what you recorded and check for mistakes and fix them. And there don't tend to be, partly I think because I've been recording so long, I don't tend to have a ton of mistakes, but there are still plenty of them. I do have to listen very carefully and fix, if I made a mistake and corrected it, then I'll have to cut out the part with the mistake. Or if there's just a little part where, there's an extra, little bump that you can hear that I have to remove, or I don't know, stuff like that. And so basically I just have to sit there and listen and do nothing else. And that, not only does that drive me crazy, but I found it very hard to listen in a focused way if my brain had nothing else to do. But there wasn't a lot else I could do while working on audio editing because you do have to pay very close attention. So if it was anything that could steal my attention away at all from the recordings, then that was not going to work. So I discovered several years ago an app called Happy Color on my phone, and it is a color by number game. So basically, you choose pictures, there's all these colors with different numbers, and you can basically color by number, except they tend to be pretty complex. There's usually a whole lot of parts of the picture. So I started doing that because it's very mindless, but very satisfying for me to kind of just look around for where the different colors go. And it keeps me interested without requiring any attention to be taken away from what I'm listening to. So I downloaded it specifically to use for editing. And ever since then, whenever I am going over something, one of my productions, something I've recorded that needs to get edited, I just use my coloring by number app. And it has helped so much because I'm not, again, if I'm just sitting there bored out of my mind, it is actually harder to pay attention and I would actually miss more things. I don't know why. It's just how my brain works, apparently. So that's been very nice. Like I know, and also like I no longer dread sitting down to do the editing because it was just so boring. And because also like I just gone over the story, like no matter how good the story is, there's also this factor of I just heard this because I just read it. And so I didn't have even the element of, a normal audiobook you listen to where you can get caught up into the story. So anyway, it's something very small, but something that has really been so huge for my audiobook production process. So I'm really grateful that I was able to figure that out. So number 3, also speaking of audiobooks and audiobook production and recording, so I have had this same little sound recorder, for like 15 years now, I want to say at least, possibly more than that. And it's just it's a good quality little recorder. It just is like, battery operated, records straight to an SD card, and it's great, but it's really not meant for doing audiobooks, for doing this kind of work. And there was always just problems. For one thing, it was very hard. Like you have to hold it super still. And if you like move, then you're going to get some little sounds, stuff like that. And also, off and on, I've just had problems with it. Like there'll be some kind of weird electronic buzz going on in it. And basically, I've just been tearing my hair out over this thing for like 15 years, like I said, ever since I've been using it. And finally, I was like, I just need to look into, like, also this thing, technology moves so fast. This thing is so old now. I do bring in money doing this. Like, I should look into a different solution. So I did a little research and digging into what are some good options still on a reasonable budget for recording. Ended up with a mic that you can connect to USB to a computer and record that way. And it's supposed to be good quality, and it also like has its own little stand, so don't have to hold it. And so anyway, I went ahead and ordered that because I'm like, I can easily justify this with the money I'm able to bring in with audiobooks. So why have I not done this sooner? So it just came in last night, and I haven't tried it yet, but it looks very professional. It will be different having to actually have my computer with me when I'm recording, but I'm hopeful that this will be much better to work with and give me much better audio quality, but I'll need to experiment with it a little bit. Might start working on the updated firmament audiobook before I do somebody else's project with this and just kind of play with it and figure it out. There is a chance I would use it for podcasting someday, but it definitely is not likely to be anytime soon. My audience is so small that it's honestly barely worthwhile right now for me to do this podcast. And so I try to keep it as simple as I possibly can, which for now just means recording straight onto my phone and publishing it straight from there and not having to go through a bunch of extra steps of getting it on the computer and stuff like that. So if I ever grew my audience doing this, I'm sure the new mic would be a good resource for that. But I'm not going to be messing with it right now. So number 4, this has been super cute. So all 3 of my big girls have lately been wanting to read to me all the time. And now that means something totally different for each of them. But they all want to, especially if I'm feeding the baby, they come and sit next to me with a book and they're like, can I read to you? So for Violet, who is 5, that means actually reading to me because she is in her reading obsession stage and reads everything all the time. So she'll get her book and actually like read it, maybe need my help sounding out some of the harder words. But overall, she'll actually read it to me, which is so much fun. And then my 4-year-old April, she will do it based on her memories of either me reading it, or there's a few of their books that they have on CD. And so one of those she was reading to me the other day, and I could tell that she was remembering the story because a lot of the sentences were like pretty much word for word perfect, and not things like a 4-year-old would normally say. Like, she was reading this story about Mickey Mouse watching over a pet shop for a friend of his, and it's like an origin story of how Mickey and Pluto first meet. And she was reading along, and one night while Mickey was asleep, Pluto basically like destroyed the pet store, and just they had to clean it up. And so she reads, she's like, and then Mickey comes out the next morning and books are scattered all over the floor. And just the way she said things was so specific. And so I knew she'd been listening to the CD version of the story, but then her memory of it was really good. And so that was really cute too. And then Lolly, who's just 2, will just kind of describe what's in the pictures and make up her own story to go along, because she'll be like, and then they were walking to their house, and then they were in their house and they were eating, or just whatever. And that's also adorable. So I'm really enjoying this stage of getting to be the one read to so much of the time. And it's such a great way for me to just spend a little time with them, like I said, while I'm feeding the baby or doing something else. So we've really been enjoying everybody reading to mommy in their own special way. So number 5, I just finished my book club book for the month, which we'll actually be discussing tonight, and I'm really looking forward to it. So the book was The Little Liar by Mitch Albom, and I really enjoyed it. I read it in just 3 sittings because I could not put it down. And it's a little hard to say I enjoyed it because it is a very difficult story, especially in parts. It's a historical fiction story about Jews that were driven out of Greece during World War II, and then, some of them ending up in Auschwitz, and just like lots of horrible things happening. So definitely a lot of parts of it are very painful and difficult to read, and really horrible things happen, horrible things being done. But the way it was told was really good, and I'll go into in a little bit some of the reasons that I consider it a really good book. But I think it's also going to make for great discussion because there are lots of great quotes that I was writing down, and it's a view of World War II that I don't think we see a lot of in popular fiction. Like I don't personally know that much about World War II, or about I'm fairly ignorant in a lot of world history, which I'm trying to learn more about now. But one thing but I don't think I'm alone in being very unaware that the Nazis invaded Greece, and that I guess the city that is featured in this book had, I think, if I recall, the most Jews of any city in Europe. And so anyway, just kind of another part of that history, which was interesting to me. And then again, just the way I've talked before about how sometimes I think the way you choose to tell a story is as important or even more important than the actual core of the story itself. And that was definitely true for this. The order of events that the author chose to unfold the story, and the voice he chose to use, and just so many of those details really made it so interesting to read. And also, I just read, last year I read Tuesdays with Morrie, which is, as far as I know, this author's most famous book. And so I enjoyed then getting to move on to some of his fiction with kind of some of that background in mind. So really enjoyed the book. And I think it's going to make for a great discussion tonight at book club. So number 6, one thing that's been interesting about being an adult in general, but then in particular the last few years, is it's just not as easy, in a sense, to really love fiction. It's harder than it was when I was a kid. And I think there's probably a lot of reasons for this. For one thing, when you're a kid, like, your standards are kind of lower for a lot of reasons. You don't know as much. You haven't been exposed to as much. You also have less else going on in your life to distract you. But I feel like it was so common for me when I was a kid and I read all the time to get really sucked into a story and to really have it on my mind afterwards. Like, I could read a Nancy Drew story and be affected like that. And as time has gone by, it's gotten harder and harder, where now there's so much fiction, and particularly with like movies and TV shows, but often with books as well, I'll just find myself bored. And I don't know, I think partly too, like once you've read a lot of stories, a lot of them do start to seem more the same because, it's true there are only so many stories in the world, but there are ways you can still be creative about it, but a lot of fiction just doesn't really kind of rise to that, I would say. And so it just has become harder for me to really get into stories sometimes. And I miss that. And so when I find a book or a movie that does that I am able to experience kind of in the way that I used to be able to experience almost all stories, it's a huge highlight for me. And I felt that way about the book I just read, The Little Liar, and it got me thinking quite a bit. And I've thought about this with movies a lot before, but I didn't realize how much it was also true of books. So I think my sort of definition for myself of a good story has become, there's two criteria that I sort of subconsciously look at, although now it's become more conscious because I've done all this thinking about it. But two of my biggest criteria for what I consider a really good fiction story these days is, number one, that it sucks me into the story. I want to, when for instance, if I go see a movie, or even seeing a movie at home, this can still happen. I want to have at least moments where I forget I am even watching a movie, where you are really experiencing the story. And that's definitely true in a different way, but still true for books as well. Like, I want to be so engaged in the story that, it doesn't have to be the whole entire time, but I want to have those moments where I am part of the story and forget the world around me, just because that is like, I read stories to have experiences and to engage in the character relationships and in the emotions and things like that. And so I want to be able to get pulled into the story and be immersed in it. And that has been more and more rare, but when it does happen, it is, I really enjoy that. And then number two is that it keeps me thinking about the story afterwards, which again, when I was a kid, was basically every story. But these days, there's so many books I read and movies I'll watch where, even if they're all right or they're fairly entertaining, it's just like, as soon as the story's over, that's, I basically will never think about it again. But I'll consider it a really good story if it stays on my mind, if it keeps me thinking, because number one, I talked about how I want to enjoy the story on an emotional level so that I'm sucked into it. But number two, I really do want stories that cause me to think. And I want stories where I'm, while I'm falling asleep that night, I'm thinking about it. And there's either moral dilemmas or just something really interesting about the story that keeps my mind going, that keeps me engaging with it afterwards. And that just keeps me thinking. I like books that are thought-provoking. And The Little Liar definitely had that quality as well. And so now that I'm more aware of that, now that I've kind of realized that the things that make a good story for me, it's been kind of fun to ask myself those questions during during for a book, more just after for a movie, but during and after reading or watching something, to just ask myself, were there moments that I was so engaged in the story that I forgot it was a story? And then to ask myself in later hours and days, am I still thinking about this story? And like I said, it has become more rare, which in a sense is sad. But I also know that partly that does mean just that, I've had more experience and I am aware of more things. And that makes me, it's just, I guess it's hard to explain what I'm trying to say, but, like I said, as a child, you don't have the same amount of discernment for what makes a good story. And also just like, again, you don't have as much going on. Like I had less other things to think about and feel about when I was a kid. But now it's such a joy when I find those stories. And, it's the ones that always make me want to talk to other people about them and share them with others and things like that. So that's just been interesting. And it's something that I also keep in mind as a writer too, obviously everyone has a very different opinion of what constitutes a good story, and things that will keep people engaged and thinking will vary so much from person to person. So there's obviously no way to ultimately control what stories will do that for people. But being engaging, of course, is a goal for any writer, for any storyteller. But I also do very much want my work to be thought-provoking to others. So anyway, that's just been really interesting for me to think about lately. Thank you all so much for listening this morning. Let me know if you have thoughts about, to you, what constitutes good fiction. When do you read a book or see a movie or a show and think that was a really good story? Is it the stories that really engage you and keep you thinking, or for you, is it something else? And I'd love to hear examples of any of what those stories have been for you. And then also for you, if you're listening to something such as an audiobook or a podcast, do you like to be doing something else while you're listening, or would you rather just sit and listen? Because I've talked to people that do both, and it's always super interesting to me. So love to discuss any of that. And as always, just have discussions about anything story related, books, movies. I love to have chats about all of these things with fellow story lovers. So thank you all again so much for listening this morning. Have a great day and a great weekend ahead, and stay improbable. Bye.